Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak, and welcome to the fourth video in our series where we are building a skin-on frame version of the Joel White shearwater rowing and sailing dinghy. Now, if you have no idea what that is, make sure you go back and watch the first video in this series where I talk all about my history building larger open skin-on frame boats and what we're trying to accomplish with this particular project. And if you don't know who I am, because you're new here, once again, my name is Brian. I've been building skin-on frame boats for over 20 years. I offer online video courses and plan sets for how to build skin-on frame kayaks and canoes. Now, unfortunately, I have some bad news for you guys today, and that is that after today's video, I'm gonna have to set this project aside and move on to the second phase in this design series where we're gonna be building a skin-on frame version of a St. Lawrence River skiff. And the reason that I am temporarily abandoning the shearwater is because my customer who commissioned me to build this boat has just all of a sudden vanished on me, and I didn't take a deposit for this particular build because I know this person and they have bought boats from me in the past. So I don't know what's going on with that guy. Hopefully he's okay, but I can't afford to keep building something like this, and I definitely don't have the room to store a really big open boat just waiting for a client to show up. So as soon as I can find somebody to pay me for this particular build, I will come back to this and I will continue the series where I'm going to build this whole boat in front of you. So for the next video in this series, we're just going to go ahead and reset, and I'm going to give you an introduction to the St. Lawrence River skiff. I'm going to talk about why I chose the particular model that I did for my prototyping and what modifications I'm making to it from the very beginning to make it work better with skin-on frame construction. And then after that, I'm just going to show you the progress that we're making every week on the framework here. I imagine this particular boat is only going to be 3 or 4 episodes because there's just not nearly as much work to do as there is in the skin-on frame shearwater. And honestly, because these videos are actually coming out about 2 weeks after I am at whatever stage that I'm at, I've already done a significant amount of work on this boat, and I'm really excited to share that with you. But before we get into that, I do want to make one final shearwater build video here, and that is we are going to take those inner and outer stems that we laminated, and we're going to connect them to an inner and an outer keel piece that we're going to be building here today, and then we're going to do all the final shaping on that, including marking out and drilling for fasteners. And I'm a little hesitant to make this particular video because I don't want you to think this is what skin-on frame building is about. This is actually quite a challenging operation, and I would never release a skin-on frame plan set with anything remotely this difficult in it because there's other ways to accomplish the same thing that are a lot easier. So the reason I'm making this video is just because this is one of the more challenging boat building tasks, and I wanted there to be a resource out there for anyone building any type of small boat with similar details to know how to do this in a way that's remotely efficient without a huge amount of frustration. So for today's video, I'm going to be basically just teaching this exactly like I would to a student. I imagine it's going to be a pretty long video. We're going to go through every step of the process, and then hopefully when we're done, we're going to have an absolutely perfect finished keel assembly. And then after that, I'm going to hang it up on the wall. And as soon as I find someone to pay me for this particular boat, I will start this video series again, and we'll go ahead and finish the shearwater. Actually, one last thing I want to mention before we get started here is that in the beginning of this video series, I promised you guys that I was going to keep a record of all the hours that I worked on the project and also a detailed materials list with cost breakdown. That way, if you're considering a similar project, you know what to expect. And also, if you want to build the same thing, exactly what you can go out and buy. Now, as far as the hours go, I have completely failed on that. I'm sorry. I can tell you, however, that at this point, I'm about a week into the project, and I can tell you from past experience that a boat like this is probably going to be about a 160-hour project if you're working efficiently. Now, on the other hand, for the materials sheet, I have purchased absolutely everything that I need for this boat, and so I have an itemized list of every single thing and how much it costs me as of right now in 2024. And I'm going to put that under the resources tab on our website in its own special document. That way, if you're interested in building something like this, you can just go ahead and use that as a materials list to estimate your cost and also to know what to buy. So make sure that you go to the resources tab on our website if you're interested in that information. And now I think we can go ahead and build this keel assembly. All right, so first thing I've done here is marked a whole bunch of reference points on the table that correspond to different measurements in the plan set. So for example, you can see I've got this full-size plan sheet right here, and I wanted to make a reference for the 16-inch layout line. And the way that I did that is I stretched a string 1 inch from the edge of the table, extremely tight all the way to the other end, 1 inch in from the edge of the table. And the reason I'm not using the actual edge of the table is you can never trust that's going to be perfectly straight, but an extremely tight string is always going to be straight. And then just to make sure I don't disturb that string when I'm measuring up to it, I put some push pins along the edge of the string at the different locations I'm going to be measuring. Now, another location is the top of the keel. So literally you could just measure on the plan set from the 16-inch line down to the top of the keel. And because the top of the keel is straight in this particular boat, that measurement's going to be the same all the way along the length of the keel. So those are the height measurements that I've got defined right now. Now, for the length measurements, I've also put a mark where the end of the inside of the stem at the 16-inch mark is going to be. So for example, we'll just take this stem right here, and if I slide that to right here, I've got that point located in space. And I'm going to do the same thing at the other end. And then for the top of the keel, you can see this is the top of the end of the keel right here. And this is the top of the middle of the keel right here. And this is the top of the other end back here. So I think those are all the points in space that I need to set this up. So I'm gonna go ahead and set the keel down on top of its marks, and I'm gonna mark the frame locations on top of the keel. And then in theory, at least, I should be able to take the marks on my stem here and line them up with these marks, and that's going to be the end of the scarf joint, which means that we don't need any more wood here. I'm just going to go ahead and take this out to the chop saw and chop the end off. And then I'm going to put the end of the stem back on that mark on the keel, and then because the keel is 1.25 inches thick, I've gone ahead and supported the stem on the table with 1.25 inch spacers, just so it's stable. And then coming out here, what we're hoping for is this layout mark at 16 inches is going to be exactly above the mark right here where the string intersects with the line. And the easy way to check that is just to take a block of wood like we did originally when we were transferring marks, put it on the mark on the table, and then check it on the mark on the stem. So it looks like everything's pre-lined up, so I just went ahead and clamped this down so it's not going to move. And then on the other end, clamped it down here, and I did the same thing all the way at the other end. So everything's held in place. Now we're going to go ahead and mark for the scarf joint. All right, so I just finished marking the top of the keel onto the stems so we can make those scarf joints. As you can see, a little pencil was really useful for that task. And then before I made the cut, I actually took the time to carefully redraw those lines really dark just to make sure I've got a good cutting line. Now, as far as how you could cut this, some people might just run it through a bandsaw, leaving a little bit of material, and then clamp it vertically in a vise. And then you could use a plane to carefully clean it down to the line. Make sure you're checking for straight and square the whole time. I think what I would be tempted to do is just to use a circular saw and run it along a guide, but I am actually fortunate in that I own a track saw. So you can see over here, I've got my Makita cordless track saw, and I've got a piece of scrap wood set up because I want to check this cut before I commit to doing it on my stems. All right, I think that's good enough. So we're going to clamp the stems down and we're going to make these cuts for real. Also, before I forget, I just want to mention, right after I cut the scarfs onto the stems, I came back here and mated them up with the keel piece and then sunk a couple of temporary screws just to hold this whole thing together while I'm doing the rest of my layout. So I'm just going to go ahead and pound some finish head nails into my height marks along the keel to act as a guide for the batten. All right, so now we've located 3 points along the keel that we can wrap a batten around to get the line for the outside of the inner keel. But before we do that, I also have to set up the external stems to see how they're going to factor into the equation. Because if you look at this external stem here, you can see that it also laps onto the inner keel here. And we got to make sure that when we wrap that batten around, we don't cut this part too short, because this has got to smoothly fade into this. And then somewhere in here, there's going to be another scarf joint for the outer keel as well. And just a quick tip, when I go to match these pieces up, the way I do it is I put a spacer below that it's just a little bit narrower than the inner stem. That way this thing is sitting up a little bit higher so we can still mark it onto the keel, but it can still reference along the inside of this edge. So with the stems fitting as good as they possibly can be, I'm gonna go ahead and reach in here and describe the inside of this stem. All right, so now we can set up the batten and draw the keel line. Also, another thing I want to point out is that I actually left my keel 1 inch long at either end. And the reason I did that was so when we get to this stage right here, I can tuck a little nail right here between the edge of the keel and the edge of the stem. And that's going to line up my batten perfectly flush with the outside of the stem. And it'll just help to guide that curve a little bit better. So to draw this line, we're going to be using a brand new Sharpie. And the reason I use Sharpies for lines like this is once we draw this line, we're actually going to stack the inner keel on top of the outer keel, and we're going to cut them at the same time with a circular saw. And when you're making long cuts like that, if you start to drift off your line and all you have is a narrow pencil line, you don't really know what's happening. Whereas if you got a little bit wider Sharpie line and you're starting to drift, you'll notice and you'll be able to correct in time. So that's why we're using the Sharpie. Also, just to say this one more time, it is really important that this batten at the end here is following that line that you projected down onto the keel with the outer stem. Because if it's not following that line and then you cut it out, there's a chance that when you go to weave all these pieces back together later, you're going to end up with a gap. So let's go ahead and do this. All right, we've got our line, so let's go ahead and take the batten off. Okay, so what you just saw me do there is I grabbed the piece of mahogany that's going to be the outer keel and I set it down on top of my workbench with some 1/4 inch spacers. And then I took the inner keel, which is made of fir that we just marked out. I put it directly on top of the piece we're going to be making the outer keel on. And then I screwed them both together. And then next what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this 7 1/4 inch circular saw. I've got a brand new fresh blade on it. And I am going to carefully follow this line right down the middle, all the way from one end to the other. All right, so I've gone ahead and reattached the stems to the inner keel right here. And you can see this is the curve of the inner keel that we just cut. And this is the mating piece of mahogany that was sitting below it that we cut at the same time to make sure that they're going to match up perfectly. So now that we've got basically the inner keel assembly done, now we can start working on defining the curve for the outer keel assembly. I'm going to take this outer stem and I'm going to put it back in place, lined up with any reference marks that we made earlier. Also, I just want to point out that I've got the ends of the outer keel clamped to the inner keel while I'm making these marks, just so they don't spring apart on me. Next, we're going to come back to where the outer stem lamination and the outer keel are supposed to meet up, and we're going to mark out for this scarf joint. And I'm going to mark this nice and dark. Next, I'm going to take the outer stem that we just cut one half of the scarf joint on. I'm going to line it up again with the inner keel and the inner stem right on top of this piece, which is going to be the outer keel. And then once this is lined up as perfectly as it possibly can be, I'm going to go ahead and draw a line just like that. And obviously this part here is going to get cut away so those two pieces can fit together. But be careful, because you have to remember, for this to fit right, you have to leave the black line when you're cutting. You don't want to cut off the line like you did on the other half. All right, so I just finished fitting the scarf joints on the inner keel and the outer keel. So that's pretty much the hardest part of the process here. Next thing coming up is I need to define the shape of the outer stems and the outer keel, because it's not even. It actually changes quite a bit along the length of the keel. All right, so we are making some progress here. So basically what we just did is I started out by identifying the heights along the keel, and then just like before, I pounded some little finish nails along those points, and then I wrapped a batten around the outside. I marked that curve, I took it out to my workbench, and then I cut that curve with a circular saw set just a little bit deeper than the thickness of the wood. Basically, the shallower you can set your circular saw, the easier it can follow a radius. So after bringing it back in and checking the fit, make sure that it still fit well with the scarf joints on either end. Next thing that we need to do here, or I guess I should say the thing that I have already done and that I'm about to show you, is we need to mark out the curve along the stems. All right, so what you're looking at is the inner and the outer bow stem. And at least for this particular boat, our points of reference are going to be the setup line that we used earlier to locate this whole thing vertically. And then I measured 16 inches down from there to what is the water line for this particular boat. And then I set up this board along the edge of the table that is the same thickness as my stems, that is perfectly perpendicular to those two lines. And the reason that I did that is for this particular plan, it measures the width of the outer stem at heights of 3 inches above the designed water line. So basically, the way that I did this is I just got my tape measure and I measured up 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 inches, 3 inches up from the designed water line. And then that lets me grab this little mini T-square that I made here, and I can use that along those points to project that line over onto the stem. That way I know that I'm measuring at the right heights. Now, also on the plan, there are measurements for how wide the bow stem is supposed to be from the outside edge of the inner stem outward at each of these heights as well. And I just went ahead and wrote those on this board right here. Just makes it a little easier so I don't have to run back over and look at the plans. So basically all I did once I identified these heights is I just came to each one of these stations and I measured out from the outside of the inner stem to whatever the measurement shown on the plans, and then I marked it on the stem here. And for the center portion of the bow stem, there's really not much change. It basically just follows the natural curve of the stem, but it does start to fall off a little bit as you get back towards the keel and as you get up towards the top of the bow. So once I had all those points in space, next thing I did was grab a tool that I haven't shown you guys yet. This is called a bundle batten, and there's lots of different ways to make these. This one just happens to be 3 quarter inch thick by 1/2 inch tall pieces of high density polyethylene. Why did I make it this way? Just because this is what I happen to have on hand. Now, the characteristics of a bundle batten is there's multiple layers and then you've got some kind of fastener holding them together at one end. Usually you've got a couple rubber bands down the length just to keep it from falling apart on you. And what's cool about this is that one, when you flex it, it tends to make a much more fair curve than just a single piece of wood or a single piece of plastic, but also you can flex it and then you can use clamps along the length to lock in this curve. So with enough of those clamps and then maybe one clamp at either end, this curve is now stuck, it's not moving, and then I can just use that along those points that I marked earlier, and then I can come in here with my Sharpie marker and I can mark that edge. So that's how I defined this line right here. Now, why don't we go to the stern and I'm gonna show you what we're doing back there because it's a little bit different. Okay, so coming to the other end, this is the inner stern stem, this is the outer stern stem. Once again, our reference points are gonna be that 16-inch setup line, also the designed water line, and then I've got this board screwed on perpendicular out there so I can reference across to the measurements that I need to take on the stem here. So same exact procedure. I just went ahead and took my T-square and every 3 inches I measured across to whatever it said on the plans and I marked it on the stem. And then at that point, if I wanted to, I could wrap that same bundle batten all the way around and I can mark the curve of the stern stem. However, in this case, I'm doing something a little bit different. Basically, the way that the plans are shown, they've got the stern stem curving, and then you've got these little gudgeons that are supposed to hook on, and then you've got the pintles for the rudder. And I've always found it kind of annoying to set up gudgeons and pintles on 2 parallel curved surfaces. I'm sure there's great boat building tricks to do it. I just don't know them, and also I just don't care that much. So to make my life easy, rather than having this area be a slight curve, I figured I would just make this a 15-inch long straight flat spot that's going to make it way easier to mount my rudder hardware with perfect alignment and also way easier to build my rudder. It's also just not that much different than the original line. So for this particular line right here, the best that I could measure off of those tiny plans was that the angle that's projected up from the designed water line right here up along the stem, if it was a straight line hitting both of those hardware points, is 129 degrees. Might be different, totally not sure. So went ahead and I got my protractor here and I clipped a leg onto this that's a little bit longer so I could project the line. And then basically what I did is I slid this sideways along this board that I clamped along the designed water line here until the top part of this line is, in this case, it looks like it's 1/2 inch above the shear line that I marked earlier today. Not the new and improved shear line I'm actually going to use, but the original shear line. So right there, and then I took my Sharpie and then I went ahead and marked this. Once again, this angle is 129 degrees off of the designed water line. It basically starts at the height of the original shear line. And when I say shear line, I'm not talking about that little bloop that comes up that's decorative. I mean basically the line projected out from where the shear plank would be. So starts there, comes down about 15 inches and stops right about there. And then what I'm gonna do next here with my bundle batten is I'm just gonna go ahead and fair this into the line along the keel. And then up here, I'm gonna project this up into a little bit of a curve. And then I'm gonna finish it off by making a little decorative end, although not quite as pronounced as what's on the plans. So coming in really close here, in addition to all of these other marks, I also marked out the final shape for the tops of the stems because I like to do as much work as possible on these pieces while they're still on their side and easy to work on. Now, while I was drawing this shape, I realized something kind of cool, and that is if I just extended that 16-inch layout line, which would be this line right here, across the stem, it actually ends up perfectly at the top of that straight line that I drew down at an angle where I'm ultimately going to be mounting the rudder. Once again, this is just my own choice. They have it drawn in the plans at a curve and they mount the rudder hardware along that curve. And so if you decide to build it this way, meaning that you decide to raise the shear up in the stern a little bit more, and you want this flat spot right here to make it easier to attach your rudder, all you've got to do is take that 16-inch layout line, bring it straight across here, and use that as your starting point to draw this line down at a 51-degree angle. And the reason it's 51 is because 51 degrees is the reciprocal of the 129-degree angle that I projected up off of the water line. So take my protractor here, set it to 51 degrees, put it right on this 16-inch layout line right here, and then I can just project that angle down along the stem. And the reason this line is 15 inches long is because the distance between the pintles is 12 inches, and then you need an extra 1.5 inches on either side of that to be able to mount those vertical gudgeons. Also, something I want to point out is that I actually laminated this stern stem up a little bit thicker than the plans show to give myself a little bit of extra room to be able to make this straight cut right here. So the plans say this external stem is supposed to be 2 inches wide, and I made mine 2 3/8 inches wide, which gives me enough real estate that I can cut this line a little bit deeper than what's shown on the plans and still have enough external stem back here. All right, so now that we've marked the curves along the outer stems, next thing I'm gonna do is take that out to my bandsaw and I'm gonna carefully cut that curve. I'm gonna bring it back in here and put it flat on the table, and I'm gonna use that same big sanding block that you saw earlier, and we're going to smooth out the bandsaw surface and also make sure it's nice and square. And then I'm gonna set it up with the keel, and I'm gonna use that same sanding block to blend that curve smoothly into the keel as well. And then finally, I'm gonna put some plastic down on the table here, and we're gonna start gluing up all 4 of those scarf joints with thickened epoxy. Now, just a quick tip here, anytime you're working with thickened epoxy, you wanna make sure that you're wearing a respirator when you mix in whatever thickener you have, because if that's a silica-based product, you really don't wanna get that into your lungs. Also, when you're gluing up these joints, you've got to make sure that the alignment stays perfect. And so once you've got everything laid out on the table and you're sure that the inner keel and the outer keel are fitting perfectly, you want to make plenty of witness marks so you can line things up. And then for the inner keel, at least, this is going to be easy because you saw that I already sunk those 2 screws. And basically what I'm going to do is dip those screws in paste wax. That way they don't get glued in there permanently. And then I'm gonna put some thickened epoxy on both surfaces, and I'm gonna pull it just tight enough to squeeze out most of the epoxy. You never wanna really crank on any joint that has epoxy in it, because if you push too much epoxy out, you'll starve the joint and then you could potentially have a failure. Now, for the outer joint that doesn't have alignment screws, I'm gonna take a different approach. And what I'm gonna do after I put the thickened epoxy on and start clamping it a little bit is, before I fully clamp it down, I'm gonna do what you saw me do with those other scarf joints for those longitudinal stringers and gunnels, and we're gonna put a push pin through the tail. That way, when I clamp it, it doesn't slowly creep when I walk away, because if the outer keel were to elongate from that pressure, you would essentially have a pretty big problem and none of your pieces are gonna fit later. All right, I think that's it for now. Let's go ahead and do this. All right, so it's the next morning and the epoxy is dry on those scarf joints that we made on the inner and the outer keel. I just checked everything and it seems like everything's fitting perfectly, so I'm really happy about that. And next step in the process for finishing this keel assembly is we're gonna mark a 1/2 inch wide flat spot all the way around the external keel, except for where the rudder is going to attach. And later on, there's going to be brass half oval that gets connected to that flat spot to protect the bottom of the keel. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this whole station and I'm going to move it outside because we're about to make a lot of sawdust and a lot of shavings, and it's just easier to do the cleanup out there, and the lighting is a little bit better. All right, so just brought the keel assembly outside, took a few minutes to clean it up with my power sander, and then I didn't catch this on camera, unfortunately, because my camera wasn't running when I thought it was. But to go ahead and define that 1/2 inch wide surface along the bottom of the outer keel, what I did was I got a 45-degree chamfer bit on a trim router, and I basically used a piece of scrap wood exactly the same width as the outer keel and did some tests until hitting that from both sides would give me exactly a 1/2 inch wide flat spot. Now, keep in mind, I'm not gonna leave it that way. Ultimately, I'm gonna come back and taper it even more. But the reason that I did it with a trim router as opposed to marking it out with a square and then planing it with a power planer is because when you're trying to plane exactly to a line over that much distance on a keel that changes so much in height, it can get really, really stressful. And you can get it done after a significant amount of time, but you just end up mentally exhausted because you're just working so hard not to screw it up. And when you're putting brass half oval around the outside of a keel, you really need that finished surface to be exactly as wide as the half oval. Otherwise, it's not going to do its job right. So anyways, I used a router to define that edge, and then later on, I'm going to come back and carve it to a little bit more of a taper. After that, I just went to the back to where that flat spot is, where we're going to be mounting the rudder, and I tapered that just a little bit to the width of my rudder mounting hardware. And then I moved on to the ends, and I just went ahead and finished the shaping on those because it's easier to do it in that orientation than it is to do it when it's upside down on the boat in the workshop. After that, I came to the middle and I made what's called limber holes. And that's just a fancy name for a couple of 1/2 inch holes toward the middle of the boat so water can slosh from one side to the other and go straight through the middle of the keel. And then I was about to start piloting for the number 16 screws that connect the inner keel to those laminated frames that we made when a thunderstorm hit, and I had all of about 2 minutes to get the tables and the keel assembly back inside before it started doing this. So anyways, I'm very glad that my table and my keel didn't get wet. And then once I was back inside, I started piloting once again for those connections between the inner keel and the laminated frames. And I started by piloting from the top as opposed to the bottom. And the reason I did that is because it's more important that that pilot hole is centered where it's actually connecting to those frames than if it's a little bit off-center down lower, which is ultimately going to get capped with skin and then also the outer keel. So pilot from the top, countersink from the bottom for those 3-inch long number 16s bronze screws. And then I just tested the hole with the screws, put a little bit of wax on there so it didn't heat up too much. So anyways, after that, I moved on to marking out for the fasteners for the brass half oval all the way around the keel assembly, and also marking out for the bolts that are going to connect the outer keel to the inner keel. And that's a little bit tricky because you have to find a spacing that's going to be even, but is also going to miss those holes for the bolts that are going to be coming up into the frames, and also those 2 limber holes that I drilled. I went with 3 inches apart for the screws, number 5 screws that are going to connect the brass half oval to the outer keel, and 9 inches apart for the number 10 screws that are going to connect the outer keel to the inner keel. And just turning the camera around for a second, something really important I want to point out is that I am going to pilot the external keel for these 3-inch long bronze screws that will ultimately connect the external keel to the inner keel, but I will not be piloting the inner keel until the very end of the build, because boats often change shape a little bit over the course of the build. And if you were to pilot both of these right now, it wouldn't give room for the keel to slide past itself and ultimately find its natural resting position. So totally fine at this point to pilot for these bolts that connect the inner keel to the outer keel to the inner keel, but you're only piloting the outer keel, never the inner keel. And then also, it's nice to have the spacing for the fasteners for the brass half oval marked out, and I'm going to be marking those directly on the facet where they're going to go, but I'm not going to be piloting for those right now either. All right, guys, so that's pretty much all the work I can do for now on the skin on frame shearwater. Like I said in the beginning, as soon as I can find someone to actually pay me for this boat, I will take all these pieces and assemble them into a 3-dimensional skeleton, and I will finish building this boat in front of you here on YouTube. But in the meantime, we're going to switch gears and we're going to start building a St. Lawrence River skiff, which, like I said, also in the beginning, I have already started behind me here. Really excited to share that with you in the next video. So make sure you stay tuned to the channel. As always, if you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. You can also find us on our website, capefalconkayaks.com, where I have skin on frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin on frame resources. You can also find us on Instagram at Cape Falcon Builds, where I post photos and videos of whatever we're working on in the shop or whatever we're testing out on the water. And you can find that same information on the Cape Falcon Kayak Facebook page as well. All right, that's it for now. Take care, be safe on the water, and have fun building your skin boat.